But my task today is to talk about the pond. Not the happiest place to be. What does it mean to be in the pond? How does the pond shape us? As I said earlier, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old who is living a big portion of their life in the pond thinking of love of self for self's sake is perfectly healthy. They're like kids gathered around a backyard pool, doing little things. The boundaries are very clear, very defined. It's all about getting our ducks in a row to get as many ducks as we can. But a 40-something who's living in the pond, who's living a life of love of self for self's sake, is a terrifying thing. And it's all too common. And there's perhaps no better example of this kind of pond regression found in the scriptures than King David. Now, some of us can remember back to Mark's series on 1st and 2nd Samuel a few years ago. And there's some others who have heard things about King David or know things through school or Sunday school. So if we had King David's tombstone up here, don't freak out, that's the Hebrew dates of his life. So my Hebrew scholar wife was able to confirm that to me. I mean, what are some things that we could put on David's tombstone? Come on, JU students, come on. Make me plan, make me proud. A man after God's own heart. Good. Eulogy virtue. Spear dodger. Good. Songwriter. Good. Conqueror of Goliath. Good, good. Killed more men than Saul. Saul's killed his thousands and David's killed his 10,000s. Okay, good. So I put it like this. He's a killer of giants. He's the undefeated champion of the Bronze Age. He's the ruler of the United Kingdom. He's a multiple platinum songwriter of over 75 all-time best-selling songs. I mean, he is the number one songwriter of all time. And he's a man after God's own heart. There's a eulogy virtue. It's the only one that came up. And it has an asterisk. Oh boy. Why does it have an asterisk? Because it's kind of something like Barry Bonds' home run record in Major League Baseball. I mean, we know that he hit more home runs than anyone ever, but steroids. And unfortunately, for all of David's well-intentioned love for God, things didn't turn out so good. Now, I hate watching horror movies. Who loves watching horror movies? All right, who hates it? All right, and when I have to watch one, I get myself, and there's really great ones out there that are worth watching, not often, but sometimes. And I get so anxious because I'm so afraid bad things will happen. Sometimes I'll kind of watch it through my hands, like, you know that? So we had a friend once who would curl down in the movie theater and watch from between the seats. Well, when we look at 2 Samuel 11, it's kind of like that. So get ready to cover your eyes because David is a classic example of an adult in the pond. 2 Samuel 11:1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab, his general, his commander, out with the king's men, David's bodyguard, and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. Now, allow me the liberty, of postulating what's going on in a spiritual journey analysis in David's life at this point. The writer of 2 Samuel definitely wants us to know that David is in a bad place. Right at the time when a king is supposed to be out in battle with his army, David is moping around the palace. He is restless, he's sleepless, and it's highly likely that this moment represents what we might call a midlife crisis today, or a second half of life crisis. David has spent his entire life up until this moment in pursuit of a single, all-consuming dream. When he was only 10 or at most 12 years old, the greatest prophet in all the world, a man named Samuel, paid a surprise visit to his household. Now, David had 7 older brothers, and it's pretty obvious from the narrative that at this point, David is more or less an afterthought in his family. He's not even invited to the banquet his father threw for this great prophet. But Samuel would have none of it. They send him out to get David, who's out in the field with the sheep. And when he calls him in, he pulls out this horn of oil, douses David in it, and anoints him king over all of Israel, much to the consternation of his brothers. Now, it isn't really that difficult to imagine how this upbringing might have impacted David spiritually. Every person develops their life strategy for getting what they want during their childhood, when most of their life is oriented around this love of self for self-thinking, when they're still in the pond. We all intuit the best pathway. Remember, it's kind of getting what we want, what we need. We find the best pathway based on our liabilities and assets and the pathways available within my family to get to survive and even thrive in the setting I'm in. And this is often connected to parental approval among siblings. If I'm smart, but my older sister's already claimed the best student pathway to parental attention, anybody ever have that happen? I'm likely to build my pathway around my athletic skills or my artistic skills or my helpfulness around the family, my sense of humor, my ability to be charming. And if there's no positive pathway available, I might choose a more rebellious path. Now, David appears to have chosen the last strategy available to him. Remember, he's got 7 older brothers, so all these pathways are kind of clogged. And he looks like he becomes the family tough guy. He's the scrapper. I mean, he's 10 to 12 years old, and he's being left alone with the sheep. Now, that might seem like punishment to you, but this is the savings account, the checking account, and the retirement fund of the entire family. And they've entrusted it to a 12-year-old because he's shown a willingness to take on lions and bears and later giants in single-handed combat with limited weaponry. And that's exactly what he does. Now, these childhood strategies can be categorized in various different schemes. One that we sometimes talk around at Crossing, so I thought would kind of highlight here, is a personality identifier called the Enneagram. There's kind of supposedly 9 Enneagram types, but they also had wings, so there's really 27. They also have subtypes, so there's really 54. So anyway, there's a lot of them. But basically, most people who study David's life think, yeah, no way to know for sure, but he really seems to be an Enneagram 8. I have some 8 in my Enneagram, so I can talk about this a little bit. It's a personality type that's very assertive, very resourceful, very decisive. They usually make great leaders. But most 8s have experienced a sense of personal powerlessness in their childhood. And it could have been brought on by bullying, which probably David was bullied by his older brothers, by frequent moves like a military family, a learning disability that got you teased. It's easy to see why David might feel that he's being pushed out of the center of his family, and his strategy is to push back, to take control, and be assertive. And these strategies are often marked by singular experiences that someone can actually, if they stop and think about it and reflect on it, we'll talk about that more later, they actually can identify kind of the moments that these things became sealed. And as life-altering events go, being anointed by a celebrity prophet for world domination is kind of a doozy, right? I don't think anybody today is ever going to have an experience like David had. In a single moment, David went from feeling discarded by his earthly father, which likely drove his rich devotional life with his heavenly father, writing all those psalms, to feeling like the most special person in the world. And ever since that moment, the focus of his external life was to rule. Only it'd take much longer than he could have ever imagined, more than 25 years to be exact. Now, after years of exile and deprivation and battle, David has finally arrived in his late 30s or early 40s as king over a united kingdom of Israel. My wonderful Old Testament scholar wife introduced me to this idea of the Davidic triangle, that the first half of David's life is this huge journey up that he's anointed king around 10. He defeats Goliath around 15 or 16. He comes into national acclaim as killing more people than even Saul in his teens. He develops this great friendship with Jonathan around his college years. He gets into a royal marriage in his early 20s. He's delivered from Saul again and again throughout his later 20s. And finally, at age 30, he's crowned king of Judah. And 7 years later, at age 37, he's crowned king of Israel. And somewhere in that 37 to maybe 40, we don't know exactly how long this has been there, we're coming into this right at this pinnacle moment for David. The first half of David's life is over. The external box of his first half of life, remember we did the boxes, is fully constructed, fully oriented. He's grown into phase 3 with a clearly boundaried and personally embraced lake of love of God for self-sake faith. And it's likely that a major part of that journey was the specialness of his calling to be king. And yet, he's got to the top, he's got to the pinnacle, and he's still empty. That's what the second half of life crisis is all about. The external structures and accomplishments of the first half of life simply can't fill our inner emptiness. We're being wooed on to the deep blue ocean. But like many people, and you got to be honest, based on the statistics, like most people, David decides that moving forward might hurt too much to bear. Rather than embracing the chaos and the process of disorientation found in this wild river of stage 4 of learning to love God for God's sake, not just for what he's provided for us, David reverts to the default mode of his phase 1 POND thinking, love of self for self's sake. So if you're someone who likes to cover your eyes when bad things happen, cover them now. 2 Samuel 11:2. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men, part of his bodyguard. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. David's fall into the pond of love of self for self's sake begins with a restless moonlit stroll and ends with rape. I know that's a strong word, but it's really hard to call it anything else. I know some of us have heard this story told as if that Bathsheba was some sort of a temptress, but that really doesn't fit the societal norms in that day. When the king calls for you, you come. When he wants sex, you comply. This is more than a mere lapse in personal morality. It's the abuse of privilege and power. It's a tear in the very fabric of social justice. Bathsheba becomes the charter member of the Me Too movement. And it's all a manifestation of David's love of self for self's sake. As Richard Rohr asserts, lust is the violation of another for pleasure or for passion. The other is shamelessly used, taken possession of, or suppressed. Lust means that I exploit the other person and do not respect that person's dignity. The sin is manifested by eights in all areas of life, and the story of David and Bathsheba sheds a peculiarly clear light on David's character. Precious little David with his little shiver shorts. And it gets even worse. When Bathsheba comes to him and lets him know that he's fathered a child, oh, well, my husband is away at war, your war, that you're supposed to be at, he doesn't miss a beat. He rushes to abuse his power even further by seeking to cover up his sin. He calls Uriah back from the war to the palace, throws a big party for him, just to get him to go home and spend the night with his wife. But he doesn't comply. He showers him with gifts to take home to her. He still won't go. He gets him drunk and tries to get him led back to the house. He still won't do it. As a matter of fact, he says to David in verse 11, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. David's bodyguard is who he's talking about here. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. Snap. I mean, really, you think David would just be cut to the quick by such a display of self-sacrifice and loyalty to him? But David's damaged self is in charge now. Risso and Hudson say that unhealthy eights, and I'm just assuming that's what David is here, develop delusional ideas about their power, invincibility, and ability to prevail. Megalomania, feeling omnipotent, invulnerable, are common. If they get in danger, they may brutally destroy everything that does not conform to their will, rather than surrender to anyone else. Vengeful, barbaric murderers with sociopathic tendencies. Ouch. That sounds an awful lot like some of the horrible things going on in our culture right now. Not our wonderful little David. But David's fallen into the pound of love of self for self's sake. And that hatches an even more diabolic plan. Verse 14, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. So Uriah is carrying this order. And in it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. His plan works. And now his journey to the dark side is complete. David is just not in the pond. He's pond scum. And from this point forward, his life is full of the consequences of his actions. The first half of the kingdom triangle is all happy, but at the pinnacle is this sin against Uriah and Bathsheba. And from that point, it's all bad. First, one of David's sons rapes one of his daughters, and then one of his other sons murders the son who raped his daughter, and then that son rebels against him, fed by the social media campaign of one of his enemies. Then there's a judgment that falls upon Israel for the treatment of the Gibeonites. A judgment falls on David for doing a census that he's been forbidden to do at the army. The end of his life, he's in a place of physical decay. And though there are some moments of hope at the end, he dies a really bitter guy. Matter of fact, his final orders are to put to death some of the people that he'd actually vowed loyalty to. It's not a pretty story. And needless to say, David is not on Robert Clinton's list of biblical leaders who ended well. But what should be very constructive for anyone longing to reach the deep blue ocean of faith by faith is just how high a height that he fell from. He was a generation-shaping leader of intense spiritual passion. You simply can't write the kind of psalms he wrote without a profound desire to please God. If David could fall into pond thinking as an adult, then anyone can. The allure of self-love for self's sake is that strong. It's that deeply rooted in us. And what about us? What about you and I? We may not ever be entrusted with the same kind of power that David is entrusted to. And the more powerful someone becomes, the more dangerous they become when they fall into the pound, because there's nothing around them to hold them in check. But if we're really serious about becoming the kind of person who lives more and more of their life in the deep blue ocean of God's limitless love, expressed in a boundless service for others, then we needed some resistance strategies against the love of self for self's sake found in this pond thinking that's in all of us. Anyone can fall into the pond without going anywhere near adultery or abuse of power or murder. Different strategies make different things. We were talking between services that one person said, well, David's thing his strategy was other-centered contempt and to take control of the anger. Mine was to be self-destructive. It doesn't hurt as many people, at least initially, but it's just as devastating. We all have our things that drive us. We all are part of a culture that seems to have love of self for self's sake as our advertising slogan. I mean, just to watch commercial after commercial, everything is what's in it for me. And it's really easy to get in my soul. And if I'm honest, so often for me, the first time opportunities come to me that would require some sort of a cost of self to do, my first response is, what's in it for me? And I often say no to things, not because I have any thought or care of anybody else. It's just because it's inconvenient for me. We all fall in the danger of falling back into the pond in numerous areas of our life at almost any time. So how do we fight it?